I'm Dan Rundy. I hold the Schreier Chair here at CSIS. We're convening a conversation on a consensus view on State Department and USAID reorganization. If you ask how we spent our summer vacation at CSIS, we did this report, Reforming and Reorganizing U.S. Foreign Assistance. Errol and Yaiboke and Connor Savoy were the two co-authors. But we weren't the only people spending our summer vacations doing this. We had a lot of other smart and thoughtful people are also been working on this. I got 3 points I want to make, and then I'm going to introduce my friend George Ingram, or 4. I'd say half of the job, I consider my job, is to stop stupid things from happening. And so what I'm concerned about is I think we've been able to stop a full merger of AID into state. I think that would be a dumb idea. We did a whole exercise of people talk about USIA and whatever happened to our public diplomacy capacity. We merged USIA into the State Department and broke our public diplomacy. And so I think, so now we spent the last 20 years talking about, oh, we got to get our act together on public diplomacy. Well, you know, go back and look at that, and then we can have a conversation. So I think we've stopped that. The second thing is, what I'm worried about is two things of saying what we're going to do is we're going to cut, there's 70 special envoys. I think that was too many. In the last administration, I think that was stupid. That was also stupid. So having 70 special envoys in the State Department, that was stupid. So I think we're now going to have 10. I think that's better, and that's the 10 that are congressionally mandated. Okay, so I think that's a good thing. I think the Trump administration is right to cut from 70 to 10. I think that's fine. But what I'm worried about is them saying reform counts as we get rid of the special envoys. And the second point is what we're going to do is we're going to do a back office merger. We're going to do some kind of a back office lobotomy of our capacities to do development. So that's the second thing. So I think we want to avoid that. The third is that there's no one on the stage or anyone that's going to speak say everything is hunky-dory in what we're doing in our soft power. No one here is going to say everything should just be kept as it is and preserved in amber. There's lots of stuff to fix. And so everyone here has spent a lot of time thinking about the things to fix. So if you have the political will, there are lots of things to fix. And there's lots of support on Capitol Hill to do some fixing. And so there's tons of ideas here on what we ought to fix. So there's plenty of stuff. So no, I don't think anyone in this room is going to say we ought to just preserve it in amber and keep it just as it is. I don't think anyone would say that. So that's the third point. Finally, I have had a very happy career staying out of org chart discussions. I've stayed away from them for a long time because I find them somewhat circular. I've only gotten involved in this because this was a real exercise. And my message would be that tell me what our goal is, tell me what we're trying to achieve, and then I'll tell you what the org chart should look like. So form should follow function. So I've spent the last several years talking about things we ought to be doing: infrastructure, DFIs, economic development, regulatory form, domestic resource mobilization. Tell me what we're trying to do and what the world looks like, and then I'll tell you what the org chart should look like. But I think a lot of the conversation in Washington, and unfortunately, has been focused on org chart first, and then we can figure out what we're going to do with ourselves. I think that's a mistake. So let me just make one last point, which is that I think it's healthy that the Trump administration has put this on the table and forced us to have a real conversation about this. This may not be, you know, so I think we should take advantage of this window, and we should at least have a conversation that's, you know, that I think we should thank the Trump administration for at least opening up an opportunity to have a real conversation. So now the question is whether or not they will take steps that are healthy or not. That's a different question, but I think it's healthy to have the conversation. So I want to thank George Ingram, who's a co-chair of the MFAN network, for convening this. I think everyone knows George. George is a friend and a colleague and has toiled in the vineyards for a long time to try and get it right in terms of how the United States uses its soft power. He's worked with Republicans, he's worked with Democrats, he's a thoroughly decent guy, he's a smart guy, and he's a capable guy, and he's a trusted convener across the political spectrum. So, George, come on up here. And give him a round of applause, please.
Thanks, Dan. My role today is to set the framework for the panel conversation and to describe to you the wine that has now come out of the vineyard. 10 days ago, the authors of 6 reports on aid architectural redesign came together and released a common plan. The panel today represents 5 of those 6 reports. The only one missing is the article by Brian Atwood and Andrew Natsios from last December. There's a lot of commonality between all 6 plans. They recognize that U.S. assistance is important for U.S. national security, our economic interests, and our humanitarian values. They are all based on a common analysis that while doing good and being effective, our assistance is not maximizing its potential. Our programs are hamstrung by fragmentation, by a lack of alignment of functions and responsibility, and the absence of clear lines of authority inhibits accountability. Systems are outmoded, IT, procurement, evaluation, et cetera. And that you would have heard more of yesterday here at the panel event that CSIS hosted. In correcting these deficiencies, there is agreement that state and aid should be shred of their ancillary activities, responsibilities, and be allowed to focus on their core missions in the case of state diplomacy, in the case of AID development. Where there are differences in the 6th plan is in the specific prescriptions, in the remedies for these shortcomings. All agree on the importance of an enhanced development function in the U.S. government. But each plan has a variety of specifics of how to get there. The recommendations of the original plans range from the ambitious, consolidating all development and humanitarian programs in a new cabinet-level department that was proposed by Andrew Natsios and Brian Atwood and by the MFAN Co-Chairs, to the more pragmatic of strengthening the USAID through giving it greater budget and policy authority and through fixing a lot of the nitty-gritty processes. The new aid redesign consensus plan that will be discussed today is built on 2 entities, an empowered USAID and a new development finance corporation. The empowered USAID would have full budget authority, which means moving certain budget and operation responsibilities back to AID from F. It would have a strong policy function. The administrator would have cabinet rank. He would sit on the National Security Council. He would coordinate, he or she would coordinate all U.S. development and humanitarian programs and would chair the boards of the MCC and OPIC, or the New Development Finance Corporation. Aid would take responsibility for certain programmatic functions from state, including in the areas of stabilization, democracy and governance, and PEPFAR. The plan consolidates certain functions within AID, specifically joining the offices of policy and budget, and in the areas of economic growth, humanitarian, and food security. The new Development Finance Corporation would be comprised of OPIC and TDA, would have the additional authorities of equity and technical assistance, would have the authority to utilize some of its own financial resources, and would have a long-term authorization. In ending this, let me just say that this is not some academic exercise. Organizational structure matters. It matters in who, what, and how decisions are made, and can last for decades. In the coming month or two, OMB, working with state, aid, the NSC, will make critical decisions in these areas, and this is the time for interested parties who have recommendations, who know how these outcomes should come, should weigh in. Thank you, and I look forward to the panel discussion, Earl.
Thanks, George, and thanks to Dan for kicking us off. A special thanks to George for really being the driving force behind the consensus document. So we owe you a debt of gratitude for that. I want to kick it off by just going down the line and introducing our distinguished panel really quickly, and then in the interest of time, I'm going to jump right into questions, if that's all right with everyone. So to my immediate left is Karen Hanrahan. She is the CEO of the Glide Foundation, she has had a really long and distinguished career, most recently serving 7 years in the Obama administration. She was the director of QDDR, and I could probably talk for 10 more minutes about all that she's done in her career, but she's here today wearing the hat of the Atlantic Council, and a really important report that the Atlantic Council did on State Department reform. So thanks for being here, Karen. Michael Clausen, Ambassador Clausen, was ambassador to Cyprus, and he is currently a Vice President of Policy and Humanitarian Response at Save the Children, which, by the way, happens to be a former employer of mine, so thank you for that in the past. And he also has a long and distinguished career as a career Foreign Service officer, and is here today representing the ACVFA report. Jeremy Konyndyk is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development and was a former director of OFTA and worked for Mercy Corps for a really long time, and is really a leading voice in the humanitarian community and in the development community writ large. He and Cindy Huang authored a really important piece, practical guide to reorganization in their role at the Center for Global Development. Going down the line, we have Connor Savoy, who is my co-author on the CSIS task force report on reorganization. And Connor is also my predecessor as Dan Rundy's deputy director and fellow at CSIS. So I walk in the very big shoes, the big footsteps of Connor Savoy. He's now the director of policy and advocacy at the Global Innovation Fund. And we're very happy to have him here. Thanks for coming back to your old stomping grounds, Connor. Connie Veillette is currently at the Lugar Center, and she is here, let's see. I tried to summarize your history and your career into short bullet points, and I just, you were working on these issues, and you've been really a leader on these reorganization issues and thinking about this at CRS, at the Hill, at the Center for Global Development, and now at the Lugar Center, and you're here in your capacity as a co-chair of MFAN along with George. So with that, I'm going to dive right into the questions, and I'm actually going to start with Karen, if that's all right with you. Karen, most of us that are on this stage are development folks. We're humanitarian folks, we're development folks, and we're coming at the reorganization thus naturally tilting a little bit more towards USAID. It's a little bit more of a USAID-centric approach. When you and your co-authors put out the State Department reform report, you had 9 recommendations, and 8 of them were focused on the State Department, but then you had this really important recommendation about USAID. It was an entire chapter and recommendation, and in it you argue, as does everyone on this stage, that USAID should stay as a standalone agency and that it should continue being a leader in foreign assistance. So why did USAID play such a prominent role in your Atlantic Council report?
Sure. So first, I want to thank Dan, George, and Errol for your leadership around all of this, because I think we've all been talking about it for a long time. So I appreciate your leadership. When we started this State Department reform effort, it was right at a time where there were, bubbling up these recommendations and discussions around integrating USAID into the State Department as part of State Department reform. And so the Atlantic Council felt that it was our responsibility to actually comment on that. The feelings were strong enough within the group that this was not a good idea, that the agencies are so distinct in terms of culture, capabilities, that it would do damage to potentially both agencies, as well as the fact that we were driven by this guiding principle of trying to, when we talked about State Department reform, we emphasized restoring it to its core mission and core capabilities and building its comparative advantage. And so integrating USAID for reasons I think many of us agree was not a good idea. The other reason is that everyone on the team who wrote this report was very had a very firm belief that it's not smart to discuss reform of State Department without also discussing USAID because they are so complementary, and because of this need to kind of refine roles, responsibilities, and comparative advantage.
I'm going to dig a little bit deeper now that I have you here, and you know, when George and I were talking about this event and what to really hammer home, this idea that State Department, any talk of reorganizing State Department should include USAID was obviously important to us, and it seems like it was really important to you and your co-authors. What about the current policy discussion right now around town? You know, you guys put out some really great recommendations on this, and do you see any of that reflected in the current policy discussions coming out of the State Department? We've talked to USAID folks, and we sort of know where they're going, but have you heard anything from the State Department, and are they talking about this at all? So,
you know, my sense, you know, is that they're not talking about the substantive recommendations around kind of capabilities and the serious and meaningful recommendations that all of us collectively have made. There's definitely a focus on kind of, you know, I think they started their effort with this desire to streamline. And, you know, all reform efforts, if they're being mindful, they will be clear on what their objective is. Are we reforming for efficiency? Are we reforming for effectiveness? Are we reforming to save money? Whatever the reason is, that's the North Star that people need to be working, designing the reforms for. In this case, what we have sensed is that most of the focus has been aimed at efficiency, cost savings, and sometimes with very new people who are just revisiting the issues that many people on this panel in this room have been visiting for, you know, 10 or longer years. But our sense, there are some of the recommendations we've made, particularly at the State Department, that are being discussed. But on the USAID front, the recommendations that we've made, very little, I feel, is being picked up.
Okay, thanks for that. Moving on to Michael. So Michael, you obviously, as I mentioned, had a distinguished career, but you're wearing your ACVFA hat. Can you tell us a little bit about what ACVFA is and why you felt compelled to convene your Efficiency, Ineffectiveness, and Organization Working Group?
Sure. So just for, I think everybody knows, but ACVFA is the Advisory Council on Voluntary Foreign Assistance. It's probably not the greatest acronym to market itself, but it is what it is.
It sounds good, though. ACVFA,
Yeah.
It's got a nice punch to it.
I think what it is, I mean, way to think about it, it's a way to connect the U.S. government to sort of private organizations working on development and humanitarian issues. And the way I like to think about it, it's a way to tap development and humanitarian expertise outside the government that can be brought to bear with whatever the big, you know, public policy issues are that USAID and others are confronting. So as this redesign discussion got underway, I think the chair of ACVFA felt that there was some expertise and thinking that could be brought to bear and usefully contribute to the conversation. So my boss, Carolyn Miles, who's the CEO of Save the Children, was asked to chair a working group effort. And what the first instance, it was looking across the literature, looking across recommendations over the last number of years and distilling them and then coming up with some principles. And as this working group was doing its work, the sense was that actually what would be even more useful, and this is what we were hearing from USAID colleagues, was not just principles, but sort of actionable, very practical recommendations. And so that's what the ACVFA report, it's 4 or 5 pages, came up with. And I was glad to see that some of the thinking in the ACVFA report actually has been reflected in when George picked this up in these other pieces, the other reports that were done. And I think the ACVFA report, particularly on local ownership, that's sort of something that's quite notable there, and a sense that our foreign assistance will be a lot more effective if we do a much better job at equipping agencies to promote and measure and pursue local ownership. And the ACVFA report really tease that up. And I think that's sort of a very important contribution that this report made to the conversation.
Can you dig a little bit deeper on that local ownership piece? I know Ambassador Green cares a lot about this at USAID, and he's talking about demand-driven development. And talk a little bit more about what local ownership means in the context of this reorganization.
Well, I think it's both creating incentives to promote local ownership is something that really has to be more thoroughly embraced by our aid policy, but also removing obstacles. So it's on both sides. So it's, if in procurement areas and things like that, there's certain bars to having local partners and local NGOs and things like that be able to access and channel more foreign assistance, we need to kind of knock those barriers down. But when you look across, you could create incentives by looking across agencies and thinking about, all agencies need to report on how they're doing on promoting local ownership and measure it. And if that's sort of an understanding of what agencies need to be doing, then more of it will be done. So it's those kind of specifics that I think will actually move the ball forward.
Excellent, thanks. On a slightly different point, I wanted to talk to you and Jeremy about humanitarian affairs and a peek behind the curtain for those in the audience that the process of putting together a consensus document amongst people that have lots of opinions on different things is no easy task. And I would say that the thing that took up the most email space in my inbox was probably a few paragraphs on humanitarian aid. And so this is something that this group cares a lot about. And so maybe starting with you, Michael, and asking a similar question to Jeremy, how was ACVFA thinking about that, especially with regards to OFTA, Food for Peace, and in particular PRM?
So, it was very much part of the conversation, but as it didn't land with a lot of words in the paper. Really the only thing on humanitarian in the paper is the sense that USAID has to have an ability to coordinate and oversee across development and humanitarian programming. So it didn't feature as much, but what I can say is that I think, as Dan was suggesting, this notion of form following substance or function, that was part of the thinking, that the outcomes that we want to see in this space should really drive whatever the institutional arrangement ought to be. And in the conversations, I think there was recognition that humanitarian responsibilities are dispersed across a number of different offices. And at AID, there's a number of different offices that have this responsibility. And so some of the work that had been done over the last 18, 24 months at looking at sort of how do you better connect the Food for Peace program and the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, I think that kind of putting the tools in one set of hands sort of made sense to a lot of folks. And so that was one of the outcomes that was affecting people's thinking. The second I think I'd say is that, a lot of our humanitarian work is done in conflict settings, and then it's about how do you get aid to people, how do you increase access to the assistance that they're getting, and then also it's resolving the conflict. And so what that means is that you actually need to have a humanitarian role and a humanitarian voice at the State Department. Where all those sort of outcomes that we're seeking sort of netted out, and I think the conversation continues. So this group did not land that.
And I think there's an opening. We call for global development and humanitarian strategy,
right.
And maybe the next effort, whether it's consensus or one of those excellent blogs that Jeremy puts together, should be on the global humanitarian strategy and what the ultimate architecture looks like. So with that, Jeremy, can I turn it over and ask a similar question to you?
Yeah, sure. And I actually, not to shamelessly plug my forthcoming blog, but since you just did,
please plug shamelessly your book. Buy it on Amazon for full price. Everyone.
So I'll be publishing something on this week. But what we said in the paper on the humanitarian structure is there are some things that need to be done. What's really, I think, distinctive about these is they're all very doable. None of the things that we're calling for in here, with the possible exception of food aid reform or finishing food aid reform, are hugely politically difficult. And I think even food aid reform could be completed with a push. But there's three things that could be done to really dramatically improve the quality and the coherence of U.S. humanitarian assistance. One is to finish out the process of food aid reform. So the Bush administration kicked this off. The Obama administration made some further progress. The first Trump administration budget called for further progress on food aid reform. They also had some ideas about how that should happen that I don't agree with. But But I think it's notable that you've got 3 consecutive administrations now that have all in one way or another noted the need to reform how we do humanitarian food aid. And one easy consolidation would be to take the U.S. Department of Agriculture out of that entirely. USDA's role in this dates back to the 1950s, when it was a very different program with a very different purpose, and an easy government efficiency win would just be to consolidate the entire food aid program within USAID. Second piece, also I think a low-hanging fruit item, is to merge the offices of Foreign Disaster Assistance, which I used to run, and the Office of Food for Peace, and that's a recommendation that I and my counterpart in the Food for Peace office made at the end of the Obama administration to the incoming administration. It just makes sense. Structuring humanitarian aid within USAID along a food, non-food organizing principle. Again, it dates back to the 50s and 60s. It has very little bearing on how the world works today, and it's easy to do, and it would make things better. I think the most difficult and contentious issue is probably what do you do with the State Department Refugee Bureau and all of this. And I don't think it's speaking too much out of turn to say that there's been a fair amount of friction within the administration over this question. Apparently, it's not speaking out of turn.
The current administration.
Given the reaction in the room, yes. The current administration. There's been a lot of focus on refugee issues in general in the Trump administration, and one of the proposals that has come out of the White House is to eliminate the Refugee Bureau, consolidate all the assistance functions into USAID. So that would mean my old office would get about a 300% budget increase. So you'd think I would be supportive of that. I'm actually not. I mean, I think they should get a 300% budget increase, but not at PRM's expense. And it's very, very important, I think, to have strong humanitarian voices both in USAID and within the State Department, because humanitarian action is not just about assistance. It's also about policy. It's also about advocacy. It's also about protection. And those are things where the State Department has a really key role. We also need to be clear-eyed about the fact that there are some downsides to having 2 strong humanitarian voices, and you can end up, or 3 at the moment, you can end up with some very different redundant systems, a confusing structure. But as I'll be writing about in this post later in the week, there are ways that can be addressed without killing off PRM. And so, things like consolidating the field presence, consolidating and harmonizing grant-making processes, consolidating the way we govern UN humanitarian agencies, perhaps moving to a single humanitarian budget account. These are all things that could be done that would greatly improve the coherence of U.S. humanitarian policy and U.S. humanitarian assistance without removing either one or the other of the really important institutions we have for that within the federal government.
Michael, can I ask you to weigh in here on PRM, and should it stay at state? Should we move it over? Should we merge it with OFTA? What should happen with the way that the U.S. government approaches refugees?
Yeah, so I mean, this is not an ACFA. I'm not wearing an ACFA hat.
Yes, you wear your SAVE hat.
No, I'll wear my own hat.
Okay, all right. Wear your own hat.
I left the SAVE hat in the office.
Okay.
So no, I think it's worth exploring. I mean, you need to have the State Department play a role in this stuff, and for the reasons that Jeremy set out. So I think the other alternative was moving everything over to DHS, which I think is the worst of all worlds, but because that's a totally different mission. But I think having the State Department have resources and a role to play here is really important. It sort of activates the Secretary of State's interest in these things. But I do think there are ways of having more efficient, more coherent programming along the lines that Jeremy's suggesting. I think that's something worth exploring.
Excellent. One of the things that we had talked about in the myriad discussions we've had about this is, PRM needs to have access to the UN system, the compact system, or the U.S. government needs to have some sort of access there. And so that's a big part of this that we're continuing to think about as well, is how does the U.S. Continue to be involved in, and dare I say even be a leader in the international system of refugees. So I have a feeling there's probably going to be more questions from the audience on that, but I'm going to move on to my friend Connor for the moment. And Connor, when we wrote this over the summer, as Dan mentioned, when we were both on holiday, that was fun. We wrestled with a number of things, one of which was the Office of U.S. Foreign Assistance Resources, commonly known as the F Bureau. why did we, in our report, reflecting the view of our task force, and ultimately in the consensus document, it ultimately advised that FB moved from the State Department to USAID?
Sure, and thanks for having me back here. It's always nice to come home, as it is sometimes.
You're welcome anytime.
Yeah, no, I know. Dan makes me feel very welcome whenever I come. Yeah, so I mean, I think this was one of those points, and I think, I think there was a little bit of disagreement. I mean, I think anyone who's worked on a task force or any sort of thing where you get 30 very smart people around a table knows that there's going to be disagreement, or and you have to manage it. And there was a little bit of disagreement about this recommendation, but ultimately, one of the centerpieces of our report was this idea that if you're going to empower USAID and empower the administrator of USAID to serve as a coordinator of all U.S. foreign assistance, we made the recommendation with the exception of security assistance. You needed to strengthen him or her's ability to manage what is ultimately 19 agencies or 20 agencies, it changes, it depends on what time of the day it is, that are involved in the delivery of U.S. foreign assistance abroad. And so, the original intent was a little bit to take a page from when they had tried in the late Bush administration to make the USAID Administrator the director of U.S. foreign assistance. And, the F Bureau at State was supposed to support this coordinating function. It never really worked out that way. It did a little bit when Henrietta Fore was aid administrator, but for the most part, it didn't really function as intended. And so our argument was, if you're going to make it, you need to move this bureau over, or this office over, to USAID to really further strengthen USAID's ability to do budgeting and planning at a more strategic level. And there's been a lot of good strides. I mean, I will say, since the Bush administration, the Obama administration both really strengthened AID's ability to do budgeting, to do planning, to do policy and learning again in a way that it really, had lost in the 90s. But this would be one more way, and ultimately would sort of serve as a secretariat to the administrator so that he could coordinate all the other agencies, HHS, Labor, Department of Education, all of these other ones that are involved in the delivery of U.S. foreign assistance.
Excellent. Connor, you've been doing a lot of thinking over the years about development finance, and one of the interesting things about this year, one of the many interesting things about 2017, is that development finance has become sexy again. Can I ask you to comment a little bit on the Development Finance Corporation conversation, and just what you're hearing about that, and your take on what that might look like?
Yeah, no, I'd be more than happy to. So when I started at CSIS in 2011, one of the first reports that I worked on was a paper that we wrote about strengthening U.S. development finance capabilities. At that time, I barely knew what OPIC was. I freely admit that. Since then, though, I think there's been this increasing consensus that OPIC and the Development Credit Authority at USAID and USTDA play a very interesting role in enabling private sector investment abroad. And as there's been a more of a consensus about the critical role that private sector investment, private sector engagement can play in advancing our development objectives, there's been more and more interest in OPIC. That doesn't mean that it's popular. There are still a lot of people, especially on the Hill, who don't like OPIC, who see it as corporate welfare or see it as crowding out private sector investment, and just sort of question the idea that the U.S. government is involved in this in any way. That said, if you told me a year ago that we would be having a serious conversation right now under the Trump administration, I would have told you were crazy or you were on drugs. I mean, it just was not something that I think anybody expected. But I mean, as we were starting to go up on stage, DevEx released an exclusive that there are now serious plans in the works to create a unified, real development finance institution for the United States. And when I say real, I mean, I think a lot of people know that OPIC's primary product is debt. They'll do loans, they can do loan guarantees, they also do various types of political risk insurance, but they can't do equity. They don't have technical assistance authority. This makes it different from essentially every other DFI in the world, whether it's the UK CDC or Proparco in France, FMO in the Netherlands. It really limits its ability to function as a real DFI and to play in a way that these others are able to play. That said, OPIC has done a lot of great things, but if we want to really go further, we do have to do this. My own personal perspective, taking off my CSIS hat, taking off my consensus hat for a minute, I would still say there's a 50-50 chance that this is going to happen. There's movement on the Hill around legislation. There's been a serious effort within the National Security Council and the broader policymaking apparatus for the Trump administration, looking at how you could do this. So the stars do seem to be aligning. That said, I think we should all, be cautiously optimistic that we're going to get a real DFI out of all of this. The legislative calendar is jam-packed. There's a lot of other things that could pop up.
To say the least. Lastly, I want to go to Connie, who, as I mentioned in the introduction, has been doing this type of really deep thinking on these issues for years on the Hill and at the Congressional Research Service and CGD. Today, obviously, you have your MFAN Co-Chair hat on, and MFAN's been talking about for years the need for the USAID Administrator to be the coordinator for all U.S. development and humanitarian assistance. And one thing that I remember hearing 10 years ago was that the USAID Administrator should have cabinet rank. Can you tell us a little bit about why that's been such a pivotal issue for MFAN over the years?
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I think that the primary objective of all of the authors in their own reports and then also in the consensus document is to improve aid effectiveness. And that certainly is what MFAN does day in and day out. And, looking at over the years at how we have run some of our aid programs, I think it was clear to us to all of us that, there's some fracturing that has happened. And a lot of that has to do with a whole of government approach. Now, a whole of government approach can work, but it needs a unified voice and it needs a leader. You can't have 20-some agencies out there doing their own thing. The example of Feed the Future is 11 different agencies. You can't have 11 different agencies not working under a unified framework. And Feed the Future is an example of where whole of government is actually working well, but that's not always the case. At the beginning, it was not working well. It was very, very contentious. Making the recommendation that the administrator be in charge of coordinating it is an attempt to bring that together and make sure that all the agencies are working in support of a development strategy and of foreign policy. When we have so many agencies working in the field, there is a chance that you're going to have redundancy if you don't have some type of good coordination. There's even the prospect that you would have agencies working at cross purposes. And obviously, not obviously, but we would hope that with some coordinator that you would have that, you wouldn't have that kind of a problem. I think that it also reflects the belief of all of us up here that development is its own distinct discipline. and that you can have an agency, for example, USDA has claimed that it knows how to put the right seed in the right soil, and it certainly does. But it doesn't really know how to work with civil society to, make programs more sustainable, or with, how to empower women. Those are kind of that distinct development perspective. So again, having the administrator as coordinator of all aid brings that together. Then that leads us to the question of, well, why cabinet rank? It's really hard if a government official doesn't have cabinet rank to tell other cabinet officials how to run their programs. It's really just as simple as that. So giving the administrator cabinet rank and putting them at the NSC on a regular basis allows that kind of input, allows him or her to have that kind of a conversation about how these programs should be run, should be coordinated, should be implemented to support foreign policy goals.
The system, as I currently understand it, is that the USAID administrator, who is Senate confirmed, reports to someone at the State Department who is a mid to senior level career person, as it currently stands. And so that would be an argument to further bolster the cabinet rank. Connie, you've written a number of things over the year, and most recently you said that the Trump administration's skinny budget would have severely undercut years of reform and rebuilding of our development architecture. Can you frame this a little bit historically for us?
Sure.
Connie, what did it take to achieve those reforms, and especially as it relates to what it would take on Capitol Hill for reform to happen today?
Sure. I think everyone's aware that, post-Cold War, we thought we had a peace dividend, and we put less resources into our aid agencies, and USAID really suffered from that. The consequences was that they ended up with, weakened infrastructure and a staff that was not as strong, and some expertise that had seeped out of the agency. So that when we started to do new programs, such as PEPFAR, such as MCC, they ended up not being placed within USAID because USAID was considered to be too weak to be able to handle those programs. Therefore we started a campaign to re-strengthen USAID, and that started under George W. We actually did have aid programs under George Washington, but that's too historical. You don't want me to go back that far.
I love it.
I asked you to frame us in a historical context, so that's
Don't
valid.
ever ask an academic to frame something historically. So anyways, into the W administration, there was the beginnings of strengthening, bringing back, trying to fill the ranks of mid-level employees, for example, at USAID, and to rebuild. The problem with And at the same time, we were increasing the amount of funds for development programs. And with that, you need to increase the amount of operating expenses so that we can actually administer those types of programs. The reforms continued under the Obama administration, where we got great leverage on local ownership and the leadership initiative around staffing. But then when we get to the point where we're starting to call for budget cuts, where there are calls for budget cuts, what happens is that you have lots of members who are interested in certain programs and willing to go so far as to earmark those programs to protect them. And then you start to get, really pressures within the aid budget on how you're going to distribute that. And guess what? Operating expenses gets hit. And so then, what we're afraid of is that you will see a deterioration in USAID's ability to carry out programs as OE goes down and as other, aspects of reforms get weakened. So we're, MFAN is not an organization that primarily advocates budget. But there are budget implications to a lot of effectiveness principles, so we have to be aware of that, and we've got to talk about it constantly.
Makes a lot of sense. I'm going to mobilize our interns and staff to open it up to questions, but as we're doing that, Karen, would you just dig a little bit deeper on this? I asked Connie about how the USAID administrator should be the coordinator of U.S. foreign assistance. Why did you guys argue that USAID should have an expanded mission set and greater control over U.S. foreign assistance?
Sure. So, we started from a little bit of a different perspective than some other reports. We didn't start from the premise of how do we strengthen development or how do we strengthen USAID. We started by looking at what are the problems that we want to solve or try to get at with this report. And obviously, there are a lot of ways to define those define those problems. We identified problems, a challenge that we thought had to be addressed if we were ever going to end this cycle of perpetual restructuring and continued criticism of USAID and of civilian capacity overall. And so, we've been facing this since the 60s, these continual efforts to restructure USAID, this heightened scrutiny that other agencies don't really get. And it's disproportionate, when you compare it to, for example, Department of Defense that spends billions of dollars a year on security assistance with very little scrutiny about its impact, very little accountability for results and impact. It is disproportionate. It doesn't make sense. So we started with one of the roots of the challenges, which is that there is still this need for a robust civilian capability to plan, deploy, and carry out a broad set of missions across a broader set of country contexts. So everything from development and humanitarian assistance to transition and stabilization to increasingly violent extremism, civilian security assistance, and more. And until that need, which has been apparent since the 60s and 70s and probably before, until that need is addressed to a significant degree, I think our group thought that we were just going to continue to face this repeated scrutiny. So a couple of the sub-challenges under that were that aid is so diffuse that it is minimizing our impact, which led to a similar recommendation that others have here, which is to consolidate a critical mass of assistance in USAID beyond development, beyond humanitarian assistance, consolidate that critical mass and give USAID a broader mandate to oversee and coordinate the full gamut. The other challenge was this issue of the gap in our collective knowledge, skills, and capabilities across this broader mission set. So we need to build those. And a third challenge that we thought needed to be addressed is the fact that there just didn't exist a civilian agency at this time that had the culture, capabilities, or confidence of other agencies to play that leadership role. And so that's what we focused on. We landed on the fact that USAID is by far best positioned to be the platform to both do what it does very well and also expand its capability, and for reasons that Connie and others have mentioned, the reforms that have been happening at USAID are significant and results-based, evidence-driven. It's an agency that has done more than most agencies I've seen over the years to hone its expertise and its approach. And so it already carries out some or all of many of these missions that we're talking about. Its comparative advantage is suited for this kind of role. And so it's a bigger change than some other people are talking about, but it would serve the actual need, I think, that our national security apparatus really needs.
Thanks for that. And I could ask you guys questions all day, and we could continue this, but there's some really thoughtful people in the audience. So I'd like to turn it over to questions from those of you who came today. Yeah, gentlemen. And we'll take 2 or 3 of these bundled, and then we'll get our panelists to respond.
Hi,
Please introduce yourself as well.
Hi, my name is Kobayashi, and I'm from JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency, a USA office. And I have one question about MCC and USAID. And the recommendation stops at the USAID administrator being the chair of the MCC board. And I was wondering why you didn't go further, especially given the importance of infrastructure in development, and also the fact that some donor agencies like ourselves do infrastructure and technical assistance together to make sure that there's good coordination on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Kobayashi-san. Any other questions? Yeah, up here in the front.
Thank you. Thank you. My name's Robin Holzhauer. I work at the Department of State, and I've read a number of your reports, and I found them very interesting, and people are reading them in the department if you thought they weren't.
That's always nice to know.
Yeah. And part of the reason why I've taken the mic is I work at the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, and that's been mentioned in some of the reports and on the smaller 4-page thing for today. And I just wanted to make sure, because I do think your reports are influential, that people understand that CSO is not a development agency, and that it doesn't have any foreign assistance funds. That we're actually, the point 1 says keep development and diplomatic functions complementary but distinct. And so that's what we view ourselves as. We view ourselves as policy, as politics, and as diplomatic. And so our funding's not foreign assistance, and our mission is not development. So I don't want people to sort of put us in that field when that's not how we see ourselves, and that's not what our aims are or our goals are. And if you wanted to talk a little bit more about why, if maybe someone does see us that way, I'd be open to hearing that. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming. One question in the back, and then I'm going to back right there. Gentleman with the glasses. Yep.
Hi, I'm Robbie Grammer. I'm a reporter with Foreign Policy. I was wondering if you could give your insights on how important congressional buy-in is for USAID and state reform efforts, because I know that there's been Congress, or at least key members of Congress, were on board with this at the beginning. But in the months since, there's been maybe some fear and trepidation on the part of some Democrats, and maybe even on the part of some Republicans. Thanks.
Fear and trepidation on behalf of Democrats, I feel like, is like the subtitle for 2017, but I digress. Maybe I'll start it off with Karen, and we can just go down the line. There were 3 very good questions, very different questions, so maybe we can just get people to respond.
Sure. So I'll just quickly, in our report at the Atlantic Council, we did actually identify the need to integrate MCC under USAID authority, and I won't say more than that. But on CSO, so this is, I have a history with that entity and understand it and value it very much. And I think, it is the role that CSO plays should be central to diplomacy. It should be central to how we view the world, understand the world, and the analytics that CSO provides, ideas for solutions, interventions. It's critical. But there are a couple challenges. One is that, since the beginning of SCRS and CSO, it's a sign that entity has not been accepted into the State Department. It's like there are antibodies there that continue to resist its presence, no matter what. And so it doesn't mean there should be no role for conflict analysis and the superb analytics that CSO does, and perhaps some other functions. But when it comes to the operational piece of programmatic and programmatic interventions, doing things to prevent and respond to conflict. I mean, diplomats can prevent conflict too, but the more operational, forward-leaning activities, it is better suited for USAID, and it doesn't matter, it doesn't matter what bucket of funds that money comes from. It's back to the comparative advantage and core capabilities.
Thanks, Karen. Yeah, we'll just go down the line. I mean, if you have anything to add, go for it. If not, then we'll move on. I saw a couple other hands, so.
Sure. And on the MCC point, the ACVA report talked about it didn't get into the details. It just talked about integrating over time in both MCC and PEPFAR as a way to both strengthen USAID's leadership, but also to achieve greater coherence across the whole enterprise. I think the congressional point is critical. Most of what we're talking about will not happen if Congress is not on board. And I think my sense is that earlier in the year, the budget was sort of the bullseye and was front and center, and Congress was very focused on that and a little less attention to some of these redesign, organizational, institutional questions. My sense actually is that there's a lot more interest and engagement on those. I mean, I certainly see that in a lot of the conversations we're having. So I think the what and how is where the conversation is. But I think Congress is, and the number of markers have been put down in some of the appropriation bills that this is not going to happen unless you consult with us. So I think Congress is signaling very clearly it needs to be part of the process, and all of us are having conversations with them.
I'll take the MCC question. So as a couple folks have noted, there wasn't necessarily total consensus across all the authors in this, and so I think what you see in this document is a reflection that where there is consensus is that what MCC is doing is very important, what AID is doing is very important, and yet they operate not in complete isolation from each other, but they're not well aligned, they're not well coordinated. The way that they each respectively make decisions on the gray area where their missions overlap is not well aligned. And so rather than go for a full merger, what we did recommend was that the AID administrator in this new empowered role that the report envisions for that position should chair the MCC board that's currently chaired by the Secretary of State. Putting the AID administrator in that role would enable a flow down through all the kind of subordinate levels of a more aligned conversation between AID and MCC. My own view on this, not necessarily representing the consensus report now, but you don't want to structurally fix something that isn't broken. And looking at AID and MCC, the broken aspect is not the fact that those are two separate institutions necessarily. It can be useful that they have somewhat their own cultures, their own systems, their own processes for somewhat complementary but different mission sets. What is broken is if they're not in close alignment and coordination with each other. And so a general bureaucratic rule of thumb is that big changes, big structural reorganizations are hard, they're costly, they have a lot of downsides you might not recognize when you embark on them. So if you can fix the problem without doing a huge structural reorg, that's generally the preferred way to go. Quickly on the Hill point as well, I think Michael's absolutely right. The Hill has been somewhat uneasy with the early signals they saw about this reorg process. There was not a lot of information coming out initially. The fact that it was announced around the same time as a 30% budget cut was proposed raised real concern on the Hill that the whole process was just going to be a kind of stitch up to retroactively justify a 30% budget cut. That's not, I think, what we've seen so far out of the process. But having that pressure from the Hill and that signaling from the Hill to the administration to say we're going to watch this closely and this better not be just a retroactive justification of a really draconian budget cut, I think has been helpful in setting the parameters that now have prevailed in how that process has gone forward within the administration. And the content, to the extent that it's been briefed out, I think the content has been encouraging, and we'll see what happens when it comes back from OMB.
I would just quickly add on the congressional thing. I mean, I think I mean, I echo what Jeremy and Michael said, but I'd also say, you know, the CSIS report was a bipartisan congressional task force. We had two senators, Senator Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire and Senator Todd Young of Indiana, as our co-chairs. And I will say that they were hungry to do this, and there were a lot of other senators who were also hungry to be involved on this. And I think what I'd really underline is this is bipartisan. This is absolutely, there is alignment between Republican and Democratic members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. There is alignment on House Foreign Affairs as well, and on the Foreign Ops subcommittees. So, you know, this is very much a bipartisan effort, and more than anything else, I think Republicans have really put up their hands on the hills and said, what are you doing? You know, you don't know what you're doing with this 30% cut, and you don't know what you're doing. You have to be very careful with how you're approaching reform and reorganization. On MCC, I would just quickly add, I mean, from the CSIS report perspective, you know, this was another one of those areas where I think, you know, you have very strong proponents for the MCC approach who think that MCC is doing great work. Look, I love MCC. I think they do good work. I think that where there is sort of cause for concern around some of the things that we're talking about is what Jeremy talked about, alignment between MCC and USAID, and really ensuring that they're not doing overlapping, they're not working at odds to one another in the countries where they're both present. More broadly, I would say, you know, I think that MCC's now been around for 13 years. You know, I think in those 13 years, things have changed. The threshold program, for example, I mean, does it really make sense for MCC to run the threshold program? Does it really make sense for second or third compacts? You know, there are a lot of things where I think we kind of have to look at it and say, does this make sense within the broader framework of what we're talking about here? You know, I think one of the proposals that we dealt with on the CSIS task force was, well, in a country where MCC is bigger, the MCC resident country director should serve as the coordinator of U.S. foreign assistance in country. You know, look, personally, I disagree with that. I mean, that's not what MCC is supposed to be doing. USAID, a mission director, should be playing that role, and I think there needs to be much greater coordination alignment at the country level. But again, I mean, there are a lot of people who think you should just pull it in to aid and kind of create it as this special program at USAID. I don't know. I mean, Jeremy's right. That kind of sort of big reorganization can break a lot of China and cause a lot of problems.
And it was Kobayashi-san, it was a red line for a lot of folks on our task force as well.
Yeah, absolutely. But look, you know, 70% of what MCC does is infrastructure. USAID, you know, people have tried to tell me over the years that USAID actually does do a lot on the infrastructure side of things. That's true. Most of it is in Afghanistan or Pakistan or sort of specific countries. So MCC is really playing a great complementary role to what USAID is doing. You know, my final point on MCC, I'm talking too long, but my final point would be, you know, I think we really have to look at some of the other areas where they're starting to do work, like the policy reform stuff. Does that make sense? Would it make more sense for us to think about, you know, is that an area where USAID could be doing it as opposed to MCC, and kind of keep MCC more focused on the core of what they've really done well for, you know, 10 to 13 years? I think the Philippines Compact is really interesting. I mean, they had a DRM project as part of that, domestic resource mobilization, reform of tax systems in the Philippines. And at the same time as USAID was doing one. And, you know, my understanding is there was not a lot of coordination between these two. And there was a little bit of a sense of MCC was kind of going over a road that was well-traveled and probably could have been better informed by talking a little bit with USAID and their experience with 20 years of DRM programs in the Philippines. But I'll stop there.
Great. Connie?
So in the interest of time, let me just talk about one component of the Hill relationship, and that is there's need for redesign on the Hill and not just on the administration, particularly around how aid is authorized and appropriated, and specifically around earmarks and trying to give the agency a little bit more flexibility in how it allocates funding and even, reallocates funding. That's not going to happen unless there's a really robust conversation going on among those that are working on these issues in the administration and the congressional leadership and the appropriate congressional committees. And so you could have a whole bunch of really great redesign going on within the agencies, only to see it go absolutely nowhere because you haven't talked to Congress and you haven't, kind of convinced them that there are some steps that they could take on their side that would make everything work a lot better. So.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, go ahead, Jeremy.
So just a quick two-finger on the Hill point. Some of the comments from Connor and Connie have prompted this. There's a real cautionary tale and a real potential example in how the Bush administration approached some of these issues. So I think the cautionary tale is F. The whole F reform process was carried out within the administration without a lot of consultation with Capitol Hill, without ultimately any buy-in from Capitol Hill, and a lot of skepticism towards it. And as a result, when the Obama administration came in, they threw about half of that stuff away. And it's gone. And now what was left behind of F is a sort of strange beast that isn't really what was originally envisioned, and virtually every report that has come out in the last couple months says, get rid of the rest of it in some way or another. And so when you don't have that congressional buy-in on the front end in the design, you endanger the durability of the reforms. The flip side of that is PEPFAR. And PEPFAR has had amazing congressional buy-in for a decade and a half now because the Bush administration did the hard work up front of engaging with the Hill and legislating it. So there's a real lesson there for how the Trump administration chooses to implement whatever, wherever it ends up on these reforms. And I think a really important political window right now. When we were, a number of us have been pushing this for a long time. In the early Obama administration, there was initially great optimism that there was a window to do some serious legislation on aid reform, and it ultimately didn't get very far, because at that time the State Department was not that keen on it. They didn't, and AID couldn't navigate around that, and so it largely fizzled. We have a setup now where you have chairs and rankings of the committees in the House and the Senate, so Senator Corker and Senator Cardin and Congressman Royce and Congressman Engel, all of whom are reform proponents, all of whom have expressed interest and even enthusiasm about making aid more effective. You have an AID administrator who I think has been very thoughtful. Some of Administrator Green's comments publicly on this have been, I'm from the other side of the aisle, but I find very little to disagree with in how he's characterized a lot of this. And I think the question mark there is the Secretary of State and OMB, whether they will support some of this. But they would be wise to, because chances like this of having a fairly, I think, consensus point of view on reforms coming from a Republican-controlled administration to a Republican-controlled Congress with chairs of the relevant committees who are on board with the basic idea. That does not come around very often. That's a once every 20 or 30 years sort of lineup. And so there's a real chance here for real reform, and the administration would be wise to seize it.
Thanks. I'm cognizant that we've gone a few minutes over, so if the panel will indulge me for 5 or 10 more minutes, I'd love to get 2 more questions. Is that okay with everybody? I'd love to get 2 more questions. The gentleman in the orange shirt and then the lady in the red right here.
My name is Chris O'Donnell, Development Essentials. I wanted to comment on the one about strategies based on local priorities. And USAID has these country development cooperation strategies for each country, and not all of them have been accomplished. And I think they're very important for a couple of reasons. Is they answer the question of relevance to those that are kind of the unbelievers in Washington, D.C. If you can answer the question of relevance. I can convince my 85-year-old mother that I'm relevant with some of my development programs. Second is AID spends a lot of time and resources on monitoring and evaluation. But if the mission doesn't have a strategy, the question of relevance is not really answered. And the third issue is country strategies lay out priorities. And if they don't have priorities, the way you know a mission's priorities is you have to meet with them face to face, weekly, daily. It could change. And if you don't have the resources, if you're small, if you're emerging, basically what AID has created is a closed shop. So it'd be helpful to know where you see priorities based upon local, or strategies based on local priorities.
Great, thank you. Up here in the red.
I'm Lucy Mize, and I work for the Asia Bureau at USAID. My remarks are strictly personal and don't represent any agency point of view. I have read all your reports with great interest. I don't think you go far enough when you talk about coordination and collaboration. I actually think you need to break some China. And I say that as a 30-year field practitioner where I witness in all the ministries of health I work with what happens when you don't have coordination between U.S. government entities. You get counterparts who are bewildered, confused, not willing to buy into your program because yesterday another group was here from the U.S. government and they said something different. And that also extends. We have not talked about the Department of Defense, but the Department of Defense is doing some work that happens in the AID sphere. I was in Lake Hawa in Ethiopia, and there were two guys who were building water holes. That was USAID water and sanitation work, and we didn't know that we were both doing it. So coordination and collaboration are nice, but if you could break a little bit of China to make it really stick, I think that would help a great deal in the field. And again, my remarks are personal.
Duly noted for the record. All right.
So I'll just take this. You know, at the Atlantic Council, when we started our report, we had a phrase that sometimes you have to break things in order to fix them. And having the collective experience on that team, from Tom Pickering to others, there was this similar sense of, oh my gosh, we've been having this same conversation in different forms for decades. And so, you know, I think what some people, one of the things that we recommended is, I do think elevating USAID to have a strong mandate and authorities and be supported to be the foreign assistance integrator is, if not shattering something, it's a significant enough reform that it's certainly going to piss a lot of people off and face a lot of resistance. So it's, you know, there is some breaking, and I also think movement of some of the, you know, rather than focusing on the boxes of where does PRM as a box go and where does CSO as a box go, but figure out, again, this comparative advantage, roles, responsibilities. Just because USAID is doing more of one thing doesn't mean State Department can't do it anymore. I think now is the time. If anything is going to be broken, now it should be the time to do it. And then I'll hand it over.
So on the country development cooperation strategies, I mean, I think those are really important and need to be made more important going forward. I mean, that's where the rubber hits the road. And if it's done well, then, you know, this is what we're talking about. At the end of the day, I mentioned local ownership. It's demand-driven assistance. It's not supply-driven assistance. And that's the place where you can understand what's the nature of the problems you're trying to solve. Because when you do these cooperation, the CDCSs, if it's not just talking to the government, the aid mission is not just talking to the government, but talking to other stakeholders in the country, you actually get a 360 perspective on what that country thinks its major priorities are. And that should be then reflected up in how the U.S. goes about providing assistance, because that's what creates impact, that's what creates sustainability. So I think putting your finger on that is really important. It should play a much bigger role in understanding what kind of aid is needed, how much aid is needed, and then alignment amongst the various missions. If you have MCC and USAID and other bits and pieces in a country, that cooperation development, CDCS can play a role of aligning all those efforts. And I think when Connie was up on the Hill, we were talking about sort of a comprehensive piece of foreign aid legislation, which was really about trying to sort of aggregate up from the country level, what is it that the United States ought to be doing, and try to create flexibility to accommodate that. So if you create this flexibility and it can be driven by the CDCSs, I think that's sort of the gold standard for assistance.
So I'm just going to jump back in here for a second. The country strategy issue is harder than it sounds on the surface, because I think everybody I know agrees we need to have country strategies. Going back before, I worked on the first QDDR, we spent hours and hours talking about what is the best form of a country strategy. You've got integrated country strategies. Ambassadors are supposed to be the CEO and lead all U.S. government activities. But at the same time, USAID, we had already been talking about the country development strategies, which included some foreign assistance, but not all foreign assistance. And so, this is, me sort of violently agreeing that there needs to be country strategies and there needs to be clear leadership. And it can work well in the field. The place that I've seen it work best is in the field, where you have a strong ambassador, a strong USAID mission director, where a mission director plays the integrator role and other agencies are collaborating in that. But until USAID has greater authority to be the integrator of broader foreign assistance, I think it's always going to be difficult to create the right kind of strategy.
And authority over its own budget. I mean, this conversation we're having is related to what Connie was saying about the reform needed on the Hill as well. I mean, if you're a mission director and 90% of your budget is allocated for congressional priorities, it's hard to. Exactly. Why would you go through the process of developing a country strategy? So, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting synchronicity between those two questions, actually, because it is the fact that we don't have a more coherent country-level approach to all the different development and foreign assistance tools that are being deployed in the country that leads to the sort of really perverse disconnect that you just talked about. And it's not just DoD. I mean, DoD in some countries is a big part of the problem. But even in a really effective program like PEPFAR, you can see this. The approach to division of labor, one of the things we talk about in the CGD report is the division of labor between AID and CDC within the PEPFAR program, both of whom do excellent work, is totally inconsistent and very duplicative. And in one country you'll have CDC doing functions that next door AID is doing, and so it leads to these sorts of bizarre situations and kind of unnecessary turf wars and so on. So clarifying, as I think Karen made the point really well, within government, when you're collaborating at sort of an operational level, everyone still has their masters up the chain, and if one partner in that collaboration feels like their principle is outranking the other person's principle, then that's going to translate down to how the process runs at field level as well, and you're going to get this kind of disconnect. So having that coherence at the top is really vital to the coherence at the field level.
Connor?
One thing I'd kind of just make a point on is the role of DoD in all of this. We didn't really push very far on this in the CSIS report, and I would say it's kind of the 600-pound elephant in the room, because I think everybody is aware that 15 years of counterinsurgencies has created a much larger role for the Department of Defense in development. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I would say it's probably a bad thing for the most part. I think that, one of the things we try to make, one of the points we all, I think, agree on is that development is a distinct discipline. Defense is a distinct discipline. The United States military trains to fight and win wars. This other side of things is more difficult. They're great at enabling the delivery of humanitarian assistance. U.S. airlift and sealift capabilities mean that we can get anywhere in the world immediately after a disaster strikes. And that's wonderful. That's something that very few other countries can even come close to our capability on that side of things. And I know Jeremy probably will agree with me on that point. But the other stuff that we've seen them taking on a role in Afghanistan and in Iraq, I think we need to be very careful about where that continues. I think, a lot of the a lot of the things that you look in the Special Inspector General reports where they complain about, I mean, you know, an Army combat engineer company can build you a school, but they can't create you a curriculum, they can't train teachers, they can't do that. An infantry battalion can provide security for that engineering company as they build a school, but they can't give you the long-term development. But there was a real frustration that we weren't getting results quick enough, and so who do you turn to? And it's created a lot of perverse incentives, and I think there's been a lot of good movement in terms of strengthening the relationship between DoD and USAID, and that we should not give up on, and we need to think about how they work together in conflict and post-conflict environments, but the development needs to be left to the development professionals, and the military needs to be left to the military professionals.
Thanks, Connor. Connie?
So on the DoD issue, all I'm going to do is plug a book that I wrote a chapter. It's called Mission Creep by Gordon Adams. And the chapter that Bill Anderson, retired from USAID, and I wrote was an attempt to rationalize where DoD offers comparative advantage and where it doesn't, and pointing out where there's some duplication that doesn't need to be there. And there are other great chapters too. And I will be glad to also plug Jeremy's book as soon as he gets me a free copy. Plug first? Okay. Go get Jeremy's book. Okay, that's it.
This has been a really rich discussion, I think, and please join me in thanking all of our panelists for. And thank you for coming. We'll see you next time.